Hello friends, welcome to this next session of Old Testament Windows, session 7. Again, I hope that you are well and safe where you are as we continue the social distancing. I appreciate you being a part of this class or study via this video method. It's a little awkward, but I think we're all getting used to things being a little different and getting more creative now. Today we're going to look at a passage from 2 Kings chapter 5, and I just want to preface this by saying that few stories in the Old Testament show the complex intersection of people and personalities as well as this one does. And so I'm going to invite you to take a look at 2 Kings chapter 5, and I'm going to read the whole chapter. So I invite you to pause the video now and take a few moments to read through the chapter. In 2 Kings 5, we encounter Naaman, a wealthy, well-connected military general from the nation of Aram. But Naaman has this humiliating problem. He has a horrible skin disease. This was not the expected self-presentation for any person in public life, especially not for an elite general. Chapter 5 of 2 Kings begins with this verse 1. Now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master, and highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. In one of the recent military campaigns, Naaman's army captures Israelites and takes them as slaves. And one of these slaves was a little girl. Now, the original language word in the text emphasizes just how small she was, small both of size and of significance. The word could be translated something like a little girl. So we have a story here of contrasts with a nameless girl slave and a named male general. And yet, to our surprise, one day this insignificant child speaks up. Turning to Naaman's wife, she suggests a possible remedy for her master's disease. And after a surprisingly tender communication of a possible cure, the little girl seems to disappear from the story. That was her one line in the play, her one sentence bravely spoken to the mistress of the house. We actually find out nothing more about her story. How would you describe her words and her motivation? And bear in mind that this was a suggested cure for the very general who had been responsible for her being ripped from her family, enslaved, and taken into exile far from her home. Why do you think she responded the way that she did? I invite you to pause the video here and have some discussion about that. So Naaman hears about the girl's suggestion, but note what he does. As perhaps in keeping with his sense of self-importance, he goes after the suggested cure using his connections, his network of power. He requests a letter from the king to the king in Samaria, and he gets payment ready: gold, silver, expensive clothing. And yet, it isn't the king who can help him. Instead, it's a short-tempered, bald prophet named Elisha. Elisha doesn't seem to be impressed with the great and majestic general from Aram who stands outside of his door. Instead, Elisha sends out a servant who reports that Naaman's healing can be had by dunking himself in the muddy waters of the Jordan River. Imagine this story not from the perspective that we hear it as a reader in the Bible or as a hearer of someone reading it from the Bible, but from Naaman's perspective, this great general. What would you say is Naaman's concept of God, and how do you think that affects the way that Naaman responds to the directions from Elisha's servant? Well, Naaman does what he knows, employs the tools he's used to using, and now he balks at Elisha's suggestion that healing will come from bathing in the waters of the Jordan. The whole thing seems ridiculous to him. So verse 12 says that he turned and he went away in a rage. And the problem for Naaman is not the difficulty of what is being asked of him, but what he sees as the absurdity of it. There is a story that when Halley's Comet passed by the Earth in 1985, at least one person was disappointed. He said it wasn't like 75 years before when he distinctly remembers hearing it go whoosh as it rushed past. In 1996, another comet passed closer to the Earth than any comet in known history. The comet was named Hyakutake, I believe, and it appeared as kind of a blurry star and disappointed those who expected some kind of fiery display in the sky. Well, our expectations of faith often resemble our expectations of comets. We hunger to see God do something spectacular, and when God instead calls us to quiet acts of disobedience, we say, oh, yeah, sure, and kind of lose interest in it. What is it that you suppose changed Naaman's mind about obeying Elisha's instructions? And if Naaman had stayed angry and refused to obey Elisha, what do you think might have happened to him? Can our unwillingness to humble ourselves ever actually deprive us of good gifts from God? Picture Naaman as he begins to immerse himself 7 times in the Jordan River. He goes under and he comes up the first time, goes under, comes up a second time, third time, fourth time, so on. By the 6th time or 7th time, what might have been going through his mind? I invite you to pause the video again and reflect on some of these questions. Suppose you were being advised by some people who have the kind of wisdom that Naaman's servants had. What might they say to you right now? What kind of circumstances in your life might require you to kind of humble yourself and take a first step of obedience, going down to the Jordan for the first time? An example of a first step of obedience might be crossing that invisible barrier to talk to somebody at church or in your neighborhood that you haven't talked to before. Or it could be as simple as refraining from doing something that you normally would do, such as gossiping about a coworker or someone in your circle of influence. Your obedience may not bring immediate visible results. You may not even feel better after you obey. But the taking that first step of obedience, getting to know a new neighbor, for instance, or a new person, might eventually lead to friendship and or new attitudes toward people who are different. Or refraining from gossiping might break down a chain of half-truths or set a new kind of an example at work or in your circle of influence. So pause and think about those questions for a few moments, and then we'll be ready to wrap up. Well, friends, there are a lot of lessons that might be taken from this story. I'd invite you to think about in which of the main characters of this story might you recognize something of yourself, and what lessons might you draw from what you have experienced there. There probably are several lessons in this story, and they may be unique to each one of us because of our circumstances. But at least among the lessons that we can draw from this story is that ours is a God of surprises, a God who turns political and religious structures upside down through the lives of the weakest and most vulnerable in the world. And then I'd invite you to think about, are you also, like the little girl in this story, a representative, a witness of the true and living God among your acquaintances? You'll have your own lessons, of course. I invite you to spend some time thinking about those before you quit this lesson for today. I've appreciated you joining in and being a part of this study, and I'm hopeful that you find some help in this as well. May God's grace continue to lead us and guide us in these difficult days, and may God's love surround you and flow through you now and always. God bless.